So now I want to talk about Constantine and the rise of the Byzantium Empire. So Constantine what he does that's very important is that he makes Christianity the official religion of Rome. So before Constantine, you had Christian emperors, but they did not make Christianity the official religion. But he made Christianity the official religion. Okay? The problem, though, we discussed this last class, is that Christianity is a franchise model. So different churches teach different things. And so Constantine was like, no, we can't have this debate. If we'll make this the official religion, what we need to do is have one orthodoxy, a unified ideology, okay? All right, so at this time in history, there are two major debates, or two major sources of confusion. The first is what we call Christology. What this is the question of like, what's the nature of Jesus? Okay. Remember, the story is that Jesus is in heaven, then he comes to earth, Mary gives birth to Jesus, then Jesus preaches his message, the gospel, then he is killed and he is resurrected. And then he returns to heaven, okay? That's the official story of Christianity. But there are lots of problems with this story, as you can imagine. If Jesus is divine, how did Mary give birth to Jesus? Right? If you're a human woman and you give birth to a God, that means that you're God yourself, okay? All right, so who is Mary and what is her power? Second question then is Jesus divine or is he human? Okay? Because if he's human, he dies, that's a sacrifice, right? But if you're divine, you can't die, so his death and his resurrection doesn't make any sense. Okay? So this is the problem with Christology. Is Jesus human or is he divine? And there are different interpretations, okay? The first interpretation is Jesus is divine in heaven, but he's human in the world. Okay, does that make sense? So, yes, Mary gave birth to Jesus, but she gave birth to the human Jesus and not the divine Jesus. Because you cannot give birth to a divine God, okay? And that's why his death makes sense, because the Jesus who died was the human Jesus, but once he died and he was resurrected, then he went to heaven, okay? That's one explanation, that Jesus is really human. Another explanation is, no, Jesus is divine. So Mary, the death doesn't really matter, okay? He's just divine, okay? So both are possibilities. What the church says officially is Jesus is human and divine at the same time, okay? This is the official ideology of the church. This makes no sense, guys, all right? But that's what you're taught. And so there are a lot of, course, people who are like, this is a stupid idea, okay? And these people are called the Nestorians. And they were persecuted by the Catholic Church. And so they went to Persia, okay? They went to the Middle East, they went to Persia, they went to Arabia, where they spread the message of Jesus. They taught Jesus as a human as opposed to a God. They taught that Jesus was a messenger, okay? Which is what I taught you, right? That he's really a messenger of the monad. All right? So, does that make sense? Okay, now the second debate is actually even more confusing than the first debate, okay? And it has to do with the nature of the three powerful forces, right? The three gods. You have God, the ultimate God, then you have Jesus, then you have the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is God expressed in the world. Okay, so when someone speaks to you, you think it's God. It's actually not God, it's the Holy Spirit. All right, so now the question then is, what is the relationship between these three? God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit. And again, there are different explanations. And they kind of make sense, okay? So the first is the idea of modalism. Modalism is the idea that Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit are just different modes of the same thing. They just change. So when Jesus is in heaven, he's God. When Jesus comes to earth as a human, he's just Jesus, and then when Jesus wants to communicate with us, he's the Holy Spirit, okay? So remember, Paul talked to Jesus. But Paul didn't really talk to Jesus, Paul talked to the Holy Spirit. Okay, so it's the same force, but expressed differently. Okay, that makes sense, right? Second is the idea of partialism. Partialism is just the idea that God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, all part of the same divine force. Okay, so think of an ocean, right? The Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is huge, but there are different parts to it, right? So that's the idea of partialism. That makes sense too, right? Okay. And the third idea is the idea of Arianism. And Arianism is just the idea that God came first, and then afterwards he created Jesus. So, in other words, Jesus is God, but he's second to the real God. Okay? That makes sense as well, right? Now, there are problems with all three, okay? The first problem, modalism, is if you read the Bible, Jesus talks to God, Jesus talks to the Holy Spirit. That's kind of confusing, because why would Jesus talk to himself, okay? So there's a lot of inconsistencies in the Bible, okay? So this doesn't really work. Partialism doesn't work either, because if you think about it, if God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit are part of a divine aspect, then that divine aspect should be God, right? Not these three. Okay, this doesn't really make sense. And Arianism doesn't really make sense because the entire point of Christianity is to say that Jesus is God, right? We worship Jesus, not God. So if you're saying that God's superior, why shouldn't we worship God instead of Jesus? Okay, so this is problematic as well.